Welcome, everybody who is tuning into our podcast, Wolverines for Justice. Thank you for joining us in our second podcast, and I hope you guys had the chance to tune into our first podcast, which was about the 1963 Louisiana literacy test and voting rights. Please be sure to check it out if you have an extra 10 minutes today. It is filled with great information and content. You can find us by simply searching Wolverines for Justice in YouTube, where you find all of our podcast uploads. First, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Christian Poselli, and I am a student athlete on the University of Michigan men's soccer team. In today's episode, I would like to discuss the topic of Islamophobia, which has been increasing throughout the 21st century in Western societies, predominantly in the US as well as Europe. Additionally, I would like to introduce our guest speaker. We have fellow team member Moshtaba Al-Hasnawi, who will give us some insight and his thoughts on the ever-growing trend of Islamophobia.
Hello everyone, my name is Moshtaba Al-Hasnawi. I also go by Moose for short. I appreciate you all for tuning into our podcast, and today we'll be covering the topic of Islamophobia and just the overall life of being Arab American. Before I get started, I'd like to talk a little about myself and my background. I was born and raised in Dearborn, Michigan, and I am originally from Iraq. My parents both grew up in Iraq and spent most of their childhood there. However, they soon fled as Iraq was being overrun by the dictator Saddam Hussein and his forces. Their lives were in danger, and in order to find a better life for themselves and their family, they escaped to a refugee camp in Saudi Arabia. There, they lived in the camp for about a few years, but then were finally able to get the necessary paperwork in order to start their new lives in the United States. From there, they decided to live in Dearborn, Michigan, due to the city being predominantly Arab American. Dearborn has the highest concentration of Arab Americans in the country, and it seemed like the perfect place to raise a family. Many people who have been to Dearborn consider it a Middle Eastern country in a way. For example, like driving around the city, all the signs you see are in both English and Arabic. Most of the restaurants there were Arab-based, and just the overall feel of living in Dearborn gives a Middle Eastern vibe. As soon as I enter Dearborn, I always know that I am there just due to the surroundings around me. Before we get into further detail, there was one thing that I wanted to address, and it was the distinction between being Arab and Muslim. Many people associate Arabs with being Muslim. However, the majority of Muslims are non-Arab. Throughout the podcast, I will also talk about how being of an Arab background has affected me and the people around me. Now, let's get started. Growing up, I never really saw myself as a minority. I honestly consider myself part of the majority, as I was around people of similar backgrounds and cultures. I grew up with people who ate the same foods, celebrated the same holidays, and many other things. But there was a time in elementary school, I have a distinct memory of me talking to one of the students on the first day of school. That student happened to be white, and this was the first time I ever had a class with someone not of Arabic descent. I wasn't too sure about his background, so I went over and asked him, I'm like, where are you from? He simply said, I'm just American. And I was a little confused by that answer, to be honest. I'm used to hearing people say that they are from Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Middle Eastern countries. I definitely was hesitant about how I should approach the situation. Keep in mind, I was only an elementary student and I didn't know much. It was my first time experiencing a situation where there was a majority and a minority. Despite our differences, we were able to get along nicely, and he ended up being one of my closest friends in school. And I still talk to him to this day. But I just find it interesting to see how things will change big time for me as I progress throughout the years. Through the sport of soccer, I was able to finally understand what being the minority felt like. And that feeling is something that I am going to have to live with for the rest of my life. I first joined an out-of-city soccer team when I was around 10 years old, and from there I was the only kid who had of an Arabic background, as the majority of the kids were white. There was a memory that I remember is that when the coaches gathered all the kids around to announce who made the team, they absolutely butchered my name. I mean, people laughed in a non-harmful manner, but to me it was just as a shock, as no one has really had that problem before when pronouncing my name. Everyone was able to get it right from the get-go. But this was my start of my, character development in a way, as there was a big change for me, as I literally went from being considered a majority in school to a minority in the soccer team. And I had to switch on between that. But I learned to quickly deal with this. However, what startled me was when soon one of my teammates started to ask for my mother's clothing. My mother is someone who wears the hijab, and I thought everyone knew what it stood for. I mean, she wears it in order to represent her religion. But I do realize now that my teammates were just curious, but eventually, there will be experiences later on in which it wasn't the curiosity that got the better of people, but their ignorance. After some time, I was finally able to cope and understand the concept of accepting who I am as being part of the minority, and I was fine with that. And I didn't really think much of it. Everyone has their differences, everyone looks different. However, I soon would have to realize the downside of being part of the minority in both a religious and ethnic way. I think my first experiences with Islamophobia wouldn't have happened without the sport of soccer. It was the first tournament in which my family and I had to go on a plane. My whole family attended the trip with me as I was super excited for this particular tournament. But there was one thing that I couldn't get out of my head, and it was the process of my family going through security. TSA took a while with us and came as a shock to me, to be honest. They said it was a random security check, but why us? I've had many people that mentioned this type of checks due to them being Arab or Muslim, but seeing was believing for me. As I got older, more and more trips were taken by plane, and I had to get used to this type of security. While this didn't happen all the time, it was definitely a common thing when going through security. I understand that there has been situations that have occurred which have caused this sort of behavior, but that's putting a label on people, and it just doesn't make sense to me. As I got older, I began to experience more and more injustices that occurred in me and my family's lives. My family, we like to have yearly trips to Cedar Point amusement park in Sandusky, Ohio. We like to bring our entire family, which can consist of like 20 plus people. Many of them are females who also wear the hijab, like my mother. And there are situations where when we walk around the park, there have been people that have made some disgusting comments. I remember a time where this random guy walked up to my mom and said, "You're probably hot wearing that. You should just take it off." I'm like, it's just the ignorance from that comment really messed with my head. I'm like, there's no need for someone to say that. And that person knew what he was doing by saying that. Like, he knows what the hijab stands for, but he went out of his way to say that comment. And there has been situations where people from my family have experienced Islamophobic comments like towel head, terrorist, and stuff like that. Go back to your country. We don't want you here. And like stuff like that can scare you. There are times where my mom, would go to the store or somewhere alone. I would generally be afraid of what might happen to her due to the fact that she wears hijab. There are stories of some women being attacked because of their hijab. And, there are also people that ask ignorant questions such as, aren't you oppressed by wearing that? Having to answer those same questions over and over again can get annoying, especially for, females who like to represent Islam by wearing the hijab. And there are many injustices that are occurring all over the world. Like, for example, at the moment, I know France has been voting on whether or not the hijab should be allowed until the age of 18. Like, to me, that doesn't make sense. The hijab is a choice to start with, and like, you have to be over the age of 18 in order to choose to wear it. Or like another fact that can also be mentioned is that children can't bring their parents on school trips if they're wearing religious clothing. And that, to me, is just absurd. And like another case where this has been happening is in China. There has been large speculation of concentration camps in China in order to suppress the growth of Islamic extremists in Uyghurs. Uyghurs are a Muslim minority living in the Xinjiang regions. China has been culinary education camps. Well, no one knows for sure what is exactly happening there, as China is not allowing for any insights. Many people, there are many articles that have been written that saying that Uyghurs are going through a massive change in the way they think. People have been saying that religious freedoms are being stripped away, as well as forced labor. While I can go on and on about this topic, I just want to share, some of my experiences that have affected me and just shed some light on what's going on in the world when it comes to Muslims. Overall, I'd just like to thank you guys for having me, and thank you all for watching today's episode on Wolverines for Justice.
Of course, Moosh. Thanks for joining us today and giving your thoughts and insight and perspective on Islamophobia. Sharing information about yourself coming from an Arab background, your parents, and how you faced inequality throughout your life. And I think for me, and I'm sure other listeners come from different backgrounds. Myself, coming from a predominantly white background, it's very eye-opening to see, these different injustices within our world. And I think it's this is the time to take something away from these podcasts, and that's pretty much what it's all about, is to learn from different perspectives, educate ourselves on what's going on and learn from it. And us being humans, we're the ones who live in this world today, and we're the ones who can make change and create a better world for everybody living on this planet together. So anyways, thank you all for joining us and tuning in. Once again, my name is Christian Polselli, and this is Wolverines for Justice. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel and ring the bell to receive all notifications when our future podcasts are released. You can also follow us on Instagram at Wolverines for Justice. That's Wolverines for Justice with the 4. We appreciate your time today for listening, and we'll catch you in the next one.